Welcome to Elixir Wizards, a podcast brought to you by SmartLogic, a custom web and mobile development shop based in Baltimore. My name is Justice Epen, and I'll be your host. I'm joined by my co-host, Eric Ostrich, and we're joined today by our special guest, Ben Marx.
Thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you, Ben. Our theme this season is system and application architecture, so we're going to dive into all that. But first, we want to talk about a very, very mysterious new gig that you've got, Ben. We know that you used to be at Bleacher Report, and that's how we know you from the conferences. But for the last several months, you've been working on something new, and I think you're ready to go public with it. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few articles released on the Wall Street Journal and VentureBeat and about the company, and it's called SubSpace. And basically what it is a network for low latency, low jitter applications, such as gaming or multimedia, these kind of things. So basically, you know, it's especially with like multiplayer games and competitive gaming, you need to have a low latency, like even 5-10 milliseconds will be a big difference to professional gamers, apparently. And so SubSpace's mission is to provide that sort of stable low latency internet for these type of applications.
Oh, I'm asking if you can just dive into that a little bit. Like when you say a network or like a new internet, like what does that mean?
It's basically a way for, I guess one way to describe it is a pathfinding for the fastest paths and the most reliable paths based on what your application needs might be. So yes, essentially it's a private network. Yeah, basically it's two co-founders, Bayan Taufik and William King is the CTO rather, and they have a lot of experience in the gaming and network and telecom area, and they realized that this was a problem that needed to be solved, and all of this was well before the coronavirus pandemic and these kind of things. So as it turns out that when we're stuck at home, we use the internet more, and the internet becomes slightly less reliable, and these kind of things. So it's sort of a problem that was already needed to be solved, but with the pandemic, then it's become ever more crucial, and that's sort of why we came out of stealth earlier. So it's really interesting. We're using Elixir for a lot of the networking stuff, as you might imagine, and it's really nice and use case, and it's really interesting fit, and it's quite busy. We're quite busy with all the things that are going on.
So we have a question here from a friend of the show, Steve Bussey, Steve's a great guy. So, you know, Bleacher Report is known in the community for being a huge proponent of Elixir and that uses a lot of Elixir. Can you talk a little bit about like the move from a company that is like a major like Elixir influencer to a brand new company? Is this changing, you know, your view of the language, doing open source? Do you have a lot of Elixir going on at SubSpace?
Elixir was Jenna who reached out to me initially about the job, did a very good job of summarizing what SubSpace was in a very generalized way because it was still not to be talked about. And so she mentioned that it was using Elixir to solve these sort of low latency type problems. And so for me, it's an ideal fit for Elixir. And this is what William and I talked about in the interview as well. So we use a lot of Elixir. It's an ideal use case for the language. And you know, there's lots of conference talks, I think, that are brewing that we would like to talk about once things get back to normal. It's just that we want to, I think, have a similar impact in the community that Bleacher Report has had.
Oh, really? So you think you'll still continue to be as involved in the community as you have been?
Yeah, I think so. And hopefully we'll have other people speak as well, other people involved. We have lots of, like I said, we have a really small team. We're doing really interesting things. And so that there should be some good talks that come out of that. And so, yes, I think that involvement will continue.
Can you talk a little bit more about like the engineering staff? I mean, do you have any other names you might recognize working on the team over there? Or, you know, I guess also just since this is an architecture conversation, eventually, you know, how do you divide responsibilities working on a private network such as SubSpace?
I would say that, I don't think that anyone else has spoken at conferences, but hopefully that will change. And we should have some more people get out and tell some of the really cool stuff that they're working on. As far as responsibilities go, it's more, since it's a startup, it really depends on what the day is really. You know, when my boss, Dan, interviewed me and back before I started, you know, we were talking about the network and talking about lower level stuff, you know, L2, L3 type stuff. And I was saying that I'm not familiar with any of that. And, you know, I can, below like UDP, have not really gone below that. And he's like, it's fine, you'll learn.
I'm sorry, what is
UDP? UDP, sorry.
What
like TCP, IP, UDP?
UDP. Pretend I'm 5 and tell me what that is.
Okay, sure. So, you know, TCP, IP. So, you know, you have to do a connection and do all the handshake and all this. And UDP are just packets that are just sent forward without any connection whatsoever. So you're just sending them along. Maybe that's not a very good way.
Yeah, that's the user datagram protocol is what that expands to.
Datagram. Is that something I'm supposed to know, Eric?
Likely. The video that we're using right now is probably sending UDP packets. So TCP has I send you something and you ack it back that you got it. This is just like blasting into the wild. So
so there's no delivery confirmation. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a lot better latency or whatever, because it's just like sending data. Like missing packets is fine for video generally. So that's like why it exists.
Well, I'm sure that there will be nothing like me listening who will benefit from that. So
no. I mean, there's but yeah, like Eric was saying, you have TCP and then UDP, and streaming applications would tend to use UDP because you can drop a packet here and there, and it's not such a big deal. But basically, we had a conversation like that, and he's saying, what do you know about this or that? And I'm like, not much. And he's like, it's fine, you'll learn. And so that's been a lot of it has been learning on the job, and it's been really rewarding as well, just because, it's something that I've never done before, and we have a supportive group. So it's been a lot of fun.
Something else to look up for UDP before I forget, the HTTP 3 is supposed to use UDP. I think it's through Quick.
Yeah,
I don't know how we say that.
Yeah.
If anyone's curious to look at more into that. So one of the things in season 4 that we want to do is also kind of deep dive into you. So how did you become a household name in the Elixir community? And what was that journey like?
Well, I don't think that journey has started yet, really. So I'll have to get back to me at a later point. I don't know. It's, I think, just probably writing the book with Bruce and Jose was pretty great. That was a really rewarding experience. I for whatever reason, I'd always wanted to write a book. And then it was when I pitched the book to Bruce, because we met in Mexico City at an Erlang Factory Light a few years ago. And then by the time I had the first chapter around, he's like, hey, Jose also pitched a similar book. Do you want to work together? And I'm like, well, I guess so if I have to, no, but it was really great. I really enjoyed the collaboration with them and the friendships that came out of that. I think part of the reason actually that I'm one of the people, I'm a fairly introverted person. So if I go to a place where I don't know anyone, I'll sort of stand in the corner. But if you give a talk, then people will come up and talk to you afterwards. That was sort of one of the reasons. Well, I enjoyed giving talks because that's how I met a lot of people, which I wouldn't have done otherwise. So I guess that's, and just giving talks, I guess. I don't know.
Do you remember how we met, Ben?
We met in Lone Star, right?
Maybe, but I think the first time we met was actually at the 2018 ElixirConf speaker dinner.
Oh, okay. That was in Seattle, right?
Was it in Seattle? I think it was.
Bellevue,
right?
With hot dogs.
Yeah,
hot dogs. Yes.
It was my first time speaking at a conference, and I went to the speaker dinner, and there was a table where it's Jose Valim, you, Lance Halverson, Chris McCord was sitting there, Jim Freeze was sitting there, and there was one seat empty at this table. And I just remember in terror, in positive, absolute terror, taking that seat and sitting with these giants. And you were so friendly. You and Lance both were very, very friendly. I mean, everybody was friendly and welcoming. That's how everybody in the community is. But I remember specifically you and Lance were extremely friendly and welcoming, and it made me feel right at home. So
that's great. I'm happy. Yeah. I mean, it's similar things for me. The first time I gave a talk or the first time I went to a conference or whatever, people were super nice. And Chris McCord, especially, when I think one of the first talks I gave was at Lone Star. And, after the talk, he's like, thanks for all the work that, BR does to, use Phoenix and make a good use case for the community. And so that's really nice. I think it's like you said, it's a supportive community.
Yeah. And I don't think every programming community is like that. At ElixirConf last year, a gentleman came up to Jim Freeze and I, and he said that he came from some other programming, I don't want to say PHP, Perl, something like that. And he just said that the vibe was completely different, and he felt so welcome, and that he just was thanking Jim really for encouraging that. And yeah, that's a real thing in Elixir. So if you're thinking about picking it up, that's one good reason.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting over the next few years, especially because a lot of the talks have been around, how we use Elixir or, how we convinced our team to use Elixir. But I think that the next few years, hopefully we'll have more talks around like, this is what we're doing with Elixir. Like, this is how, like what we wouldn't have been able to do with another language, or this is how we've used Elixir in a way that other people haven't used it, get to sort of a next stage of Elixir use cases.
Before we get too far away from this, I want to, you mentioned you're introverted, and a great way to get people to talk to you at a conference is to give a talk, because then afterwards they come up. I also use that cheat code. Yeah, I specifically remember that was the speaker dinner was my first time talking as well. And Justice went to me and says, "There's one seat left. I'm going sitting there." And I was like, "No way am I going anywhere near that table." So yeah, it's definitely, if you're interested in becoming I don't know, if you're also an introvert and can stand on a table, like in front of people, it's a great way to meet people. They just come up to you afterwards.
Yeah, and it's not, I don't enjoy necessarily giving talks. Like, I don't, you know what I mean? Like, it's not something that gives me a lot of, something that I look forward to, but immediately afterwards, it's fun because you get to talk to people, but it's not like, it's not something that comes easy. But it's also kind of, I think one of the interesting things about speaking as well is because I always assumed that whoever was speaking was, an expert matter on everything related to the language or the concept that they were talking about or whatever. And, it's really, I think anyone can give a talk if you just find something that that you're interested in and can come up with like a coherent message for 30, which is probably I think 30 minutes is probably a good conference talk, then you should definitely submit a talk. And the more people that we have speaking about different things, is the better the community will be, I think.
Okay, so season 4 is also about architecture and like system design. So what does architecture mean to you?
Generally speaking, I guess it's just, I think people maybe think of architecture as a static thing, but software generally and then architecture specifically, I feel it's like a dynamic thing. Even in production, like people are like, "Oh, don't deploy to production," but we deploy to production all the time in most jobs. So I think of it more of architecture is more of like a biological structure than a static building. Even though like a building itself obviously is not static either. You have people, coming in and out, and carpets changing and pipes changing and all these kind of things. But yeah, I guess so.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, because one answer that we've received to this question was that architecture are the parts of your system that are hard to change. But you seem to be implying the opposite. These are the things that will change.
Not necessarily. They're not easy to change necessarily. Just like adding a third room, like a third floor to a building is not an easy thing to change. But I think if you think that your architecture is finished or completed, then you're looking at it in a way that precludes you from seeing different opportunities or different changes. And actually that was at BR, that was one of the interesting things was, I'd been there for a long time, or we, especially in like the early days, we hired people and taught them Elixir on the job, and they would come up with a different pattern that I wouldn't have thought of doing. And that was really cool because it was like, oh, this is someone who's come to this language and they've applied other things to it and come up with a different solution. And so if we'd stuck with this sort of ideal of what our architecture would be, we might not have changed it to include their plans or their changes.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference, if there is any, between architecture and design?
I guess design is more of the abstract concept of what the architecture should be, and then architecture is what your system actually is, perhaps.
Do you have any opinions on domain-driven design?
I'm not really a big fan. I'm not a fan of using all of these sort of words to describe something in a more highfalutin way. Then I'd rather speak plainly about something than using sort of these terminologies that mean one thing to one person and another to another. So I guess the way that how do I feel about design, domain-driven design? Is that what you're saying? I think it makes a lot of sense, but it sort of also, instead of calling it domain-driven design, just saying what the piece of architecture does, it's a bit easier to express it.
So maybe you could tell us what domain-driven design mean to you, because I think this is the other thing is not everybody agrees on the definition. So what is your definition of it?
Well, my definition is probably wrong because I'm not well versed in like what the domain-driven design is. Just sounds like it would be, domain-driven design is what is this? You have something and you want to do something with that according to some sort of requirements you have.
So letting the requirements drive it.
Yeah, to some degree. What would you correct me and tell me is the correct definition?
Oh, I wouldn't correct you. I certainly wouldn't. I would not correct you. Yeah, we've been trying to ask, because I think part of the question is like what, because there's obviously the book on domain driven design that has like the canonical response, right? And so if you were the type of person that was very pedantic, you would reference that definition. But the real definition of a thing is what people believe it to be. And so I think that your opinion on what it is actually much more heavily weighted, in my view, than like what, this book says versus this book, because your opinion is actually how it plays out in real life, which I'm sure the authors and the credentialed experts would all, I'm sure that they're pulling their hair out right now and throwing their phone across the room, but I couldn't care less.
No, but I mean, but you make a good point. Like if there's how do you make sure that, if you have the expert's view or not? I mean, I don't want to speak generally about experts, but experts in this sort of very slim case. And I feel like a lot of words in software are tossed around very, very loosely. And so then it becomes much harder to understand precisely what the other person is saying if you don't have like, if you're not steeped in like domain driven design, but then people toss around the word, without that expertise, then it becomes much harder to reason about what that is.
Right. I will say that my understanding of domain driven design is pretty close to what you described, which is that the architecture is derived from the business logic of the domain, which I think is almost a tautology in a sense, because how do you generate an architecture that is not derived from the requirements of the domain? Like in Elixir, we have contexts, and I think contexts lend themselves to domain-driven design in a way that like an MVC architecture or like object-oriented design doesn't necessarily lend itself to that. So,
yeah, I mean, it's just basically the scientific method, right? You have a hypothesis and you want to prove it, and if it doesn't work, then you adjust it, and then there's your domain. And then it's like data driven. It's just the scientific method, isn't it? To some degree.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, I don't know. And this is why I don't get tied up with these fancy terms.
Yeah, so before we get into some specifics, we have one more kind of general question about like how you might lay out an application. So like, one of the big concerns typically with most web apps or just applications is like authentication and authorization. So where do you typically place that? Like, is that at a controller, or is that at like a context, or where might you stick that system?
Well, I guess it depends on the scale of your company. If it's, if you can put everything into one application, all the better. But if you have a distributed system, then I imagine that would live in its own system, in its own service rather, and then you would communicate somehow with the other systems. I don't know. I mean, we didn't really use context as such at Bleacher Report because all of our Phoenix apps were pretty old before contexts were a thing, and but I mentioned that I would this is probably a bit old fashioned at this point, but put it in the controller, and I can't even remember what the function would be that we would do or that we would use, but let's just have some check before controller action, I suppose, for the authorization, for the authentication, perhaps somewhere else.
Can you talk a little bit about your time at Bleacher Report? Obviously, whatever you're able to talk about, specifically we want to talk about, lessons that you learned. I'd also really like to hear about like a narrative history of, when you started there, maybe what did the architecture look like and what were some of the bigger decisions and turning points?
I mean, when I started, it was we sort of talked about this in talks and such, but more specifically, I guess, it was an interesting time. It was a transition from sort of one period of BR to another. And now I think BR is doing another period with a new group of people as well. When I started, it was more about aggregating information from different spots and pulling that into one place. And then as the user base grew, that became harder to do. So part of the first couple of years of my time at BR was around moving off of Ruby and onto Elixir. And as part of that was rewriting the structure of the applications and how they communicate, and sort of also, as we brought on new people, they were also, given responsibility to take control of this application or these services or whatever, and do similar type things. And then now what BR is doing is, if you look at the app, you can see that there's the whole social aspect, and there's about connecting with people and about sharing the experience with that. So, you maybe have someone else talk about what they're doing now. But I think that the big transition as far as architecture was pulling things into their own domains, in the sense that before it was sort of a monolith-ish type of thing with a couple of services. And then over the next couple of years, it was, how do we break these into sort of single responsibility services, not microservices, but services that can stand on their own, and to be more resilient.
So would you say they were microliths?
They were services that could stand on their own. I don't know. No, I know. It's like I saw some. What was it? Microlith? Is that the new thing? Or no, macro service? That's the new thing, right?
I've seen macrolith, and just.
Yeah, but this goes back kind of talking about speaking plainly. Like, who cares? Like, we'll just call it what it is. It's just a service that does something. Like, I mean, and that was. I'm just becoming a curmudgeon, I guess, but.
Become a curmudgeon. I'm a curmudgeon.
Yeah.
Join the curmudgeon club. I'm over here like, if you're trying to build a microservice architecture and you don't have like a serious use case for it, stop. Just build a monolith. Just put it all in one repo. It'll make your life so much easier. I don't know why everybody's trying to like serviceify everything.
I saw something recently that was like, stop building. Like, you probably don't need a microservice because Amazon went for 7 years or like up to 2001 or something, doing like $1 billion a quarter in a monolithic application. Like, you don't, like, if they can do that, you can do that.
Isn't Facebook still just a big PHP app? Like, isn't it just what? I'm sorry, but go on, Ben. What were you going to say? You're the guest here.
No. What was I going to say? I think probably one of the reasons that we come up with these new names is because people want to, have like a catchy thing for them to be associated with. And now I came up with this term, or it's in any industry or like anything to have a sort of the zeitgeist. Well, now we're doing microservices, now we're doing macro services, now we're doing monoliths, etc. But speaking from experience, BR had a pretty large scale, and SubSpace also has quite a high scale. And I've worked at companies with smaller scales, and the cognitive overhead of bringing on another service is actually quite a lot, is pretty high. And also the fact that you have to deal with the communications between services. You're probably using AWS or GCP or something, and we've had some interesting, at different companies had some interesting experiences when things react in different ways or when requests get lost somewhere. And so if you can keep everything into a single service, then all the better, I think. Might not be as exciting, but you don't want exciting when you want to have something run stably, I guess.
So I guess one thing I'm curious, I think Bleacher Report used Kafka. I based on what I've heard, filter out. Like, what was your experience using that? Because mine currently is just trying to set one up for production, and I believe it's impossible.
It's Kafka-esque. I don't know. I also don't know why they called it Kafka, because Franz Kafka is all about sort of labyrinth and sort of mindless bureaucracy and people metamorphosizing into cockroaches.
I think engineers are absolutely the worst possible people at naming things. I just found a library. I'm going to just rant about this for 2 seconds, which is AOL has a library called Moloch. Okay. Moloch is the Canaanite god of child sacrifice. Like, what could possibly compel you to do something so idiotic as naming a major part of your like library Moloch? Like, it's like if I named it like Hitler or like Mao or like, what are you anyway? It's just so bad. Yeah, Kafka, like absurdity and confusion. Is that what you want your library associated with?
No, Cassandra too.
Oh, Cassandra.
Cassandra's she was a Trojan prophetess who tried to warn about the Greeks attacking, and everyone ignored her. So I don't know what that says about Cassandra, but interesting choices. Well, yeah, Kafka is pretty heavily used, but again, you'd have to maybe have someone who's at BR now speak about what they're doing with it. But all things equal, I think that I would try to, unless you have a good use case for it, or have the ops team or outsource, or have a third party company maintain it for you, then I would not use Kafka. Just because, again, it's more overhead, and what are your use case? What do you really need it for? Why are you using Kafka? Can you speak about your experience with why you would use Kafka or why you're using Kafka?
So this was for a client who wanted to use it. I think they didn't have a particular use case at the time. It was just like they needed a queuing system to talk to, because they have like some Python services and Elixir services, and they just picked Kafka. And then I think we're asking like, oh, why Kafka? Why not RabbitMQ or this other thing? And then it just stuck with Kafka. And apparently just to give the answer that the person who named it because it is a system optimized for writing, and he liked Kafka's work.
So he has bad taste. I'm playing. Actually, Kafka's great. I'm messing around. Yeah.
Actually, the Erlang library for Kafka is called Broad, and it's Max Broad was one of Kafka's friends, and I believe he was supposed to burn all of Kafka's writings after Kafka died, but instead he published them. So
wow.
There's also, I think, a secondary library in Elixir called, it's like Elise or Eliza or something. That's like his wife or something like that.
Let's circle all the way back to the beginning. Talk a little bit more about the work you're doing at your new role, specifically about like what you've been learning. 'Cause, you said you've been learning a lot, and like specifically like jump into it. Like tell us, and feel free to dive deep because our audience is mostly technical and they love the nitty gritty.
Well, I mean, there's not so much that I can say openly quite yet because we need to figure out exactly what we're going to talk about. But I mean, I suppose at some point, once hopefully conferences begin again, we have some interesting stuff to talk about. But when I mentioned like L2 and L3, so L4 to L7 is sort of the application layer with the TCP, IP, UDP, all this stuff. L3 is the routing layer, so routing between like switches or peers or these kind of things. And then L2 is like the data link layer. And then L1 is the actual physical layer where you plug stuff into routers or switches or whatever. So a lot of it's been me just, hey, here's this concept, like, what is a peer, or what does that mean in networking? And, I had no idea what that meant. So a lot of it was actually learning about, what BGP is, what the border gateway protocol is, how packets get routed around the internet. I mean, if we're working on this low latency network, then I probably need to know how that happens. And we have like a network engineering team that's full-time working on the network itself. And so we've been partnering with them because they'll ultimately be using stuff we write and to use it to make the network be that much more efficient. And so it's been a lot of fun. But I feel like in some ways, like the first day of university or something where it's like, I have no idea what I'm doing. So can you show me this? And then I'm, asking all these questions. And so a lot of it's just been about learning how packets get sent around the internet from one place to another. And what happens if these packets get lost? What happens, why is the internet efficient at all? Or why is it inefficient at all? And a lot of these things have been around for a long time. So I was, before the interview, I was like, what should I study for? How should I prepare? And I was sent a bunch of articles about different things and about how, and one of the interesting things that caught out to me was that different like nation states can take these packets, impersonate them, and redirect traffic to different parts of the world so that they can basically see, introspect the traffic that's coming to them and do stuff with it. And then also even some of the funnier stuff, funnier, quote unquote. But I think in Pakistan, they accidentally turned off part of the internet because of YouTube or something. And so then half of, the internet in Pakistan was unreachable for a while. And I'll send you the link afterwards so I can verify what I'm saying. But mostly it's been around how does the internet actually work at a lower level.
You mentioned nation states redirecting traffic. I was going to ask you a slightly joke question. That's the border gateway protocol is what does that. I was going to ask if your service could alter that, because I think it's fairly insecure and you can just like send packets.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Cloudflare and maybe like the CNCF, like a cloud native cloud foundation thing. I think it's RPKI is what it's called. Yeah. Resource public key infrastructure is a new thing to help make the internet more secure or make BGP routing more secure.
And the other thing I wanted to mention was that you had said layer like 1 through 7. That's for people who may not know and want to look up more. That's the OSI model of networking. And we'll have a link to the Wikipedia.
How have you all been doing with? Do you have quarantine in where you are, shelter at home or whatever they call it?
Yeah, Maryland has got some of the strictest policies, but some of the most lax enforcement, which is a really nice. I mean, I disagree with the strict policy, but I agree with the lax enforcement. But it's a nice gray area where, plenty of room for institutional malfeasance. I'm curious because, one thing that kind of came up before the call was, working from home and your process of going to a new role right in the middle of this whole thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we moved to LA. SubSpace is in LA. We moved down from the Bay Area. It was, we had a baby last year, and Howie and I were talking about next steps. What will we do? And it's like, well, we need to find a new place because our current place wasn't the good size for a baby, but no new job and not going to do anything crazy. And so then we ended up moving and got a new job with a baby all at the beginning of the year. And so the transition was pretty pleasant. I mean, the SubSpace was super helpful in getting us down here and making sure we were well taken care of. But then, we have a very light process and a very analog process actually for, tracking work. And so then suddenly we had to go remote, but we were pretty good about taking that very lightweight process and turning it into a digital process and we basically keep all of our information as close to the code as possible. So like in like a pull request or something, and that's one of the nice things as well about SubSpace is that you have a lot of ownership of your system that you're responsible for. It's literally called like responsible engineer. So there's a lot of latitude and also a lot of expectations that come with saying, well, this is what my system needs, or this is what we need to do, or this is how these two systems should integrate. And it's really a bottom up driven organization. I mean, we're a very small company, so there's not that many layers between like CTO and anyone else. It's really nice to have that sort of flexibility and responsibility to drive things forward.
I'm curious, it's come up in recent conversations. Sophie De Benedetto wrote a piece on how now all developers are project managers because once you're forced to be home, you have to manage your own priorities and everything. I'm curious, do you have rhythms or practices that have helped you communicate and stay organized?
Yeah, I mean, we have like daily check-ins, which are pretty useful because that's really the time that we touch base with everyone to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then people who are sort of working on the same system will typically be on, they sort of decide how they want to communicate with each other, whether that's like on a video conference or whether that's just checking in on Slack or whatever. One of the things as well, there's a ton of stuff. It's a startup and we have, pretty ambitious plans. So there's tons of things that we need to get done. But one of the things that our boss said was, make sure that you take time, don't turn this into like work isn't the only thing, make sure that you have a day like you would before, take a break for lunch, stop in the evening, spend some time, because otherwise your days are going to bleed into each other. And I think that's something that was super helpful. Also really nice for him to just come out and say, like he says, it's probably once a week, maybe just saying that, make sure that you have the time. Because right now, it does feel like sort of an endless day. I mean, I think today's Tuesday, but you could say it's Thursday or Wednesday or any other day. And I'd probably be like, that sounds right.
I definitely woke up this morning and thought that it was Saturday, I think. I was like, oh, good. It's a free day. I can do whatever I want.
Yeah. Well, you have a baby, so there's never a free day, right?
He's at the age right now where you can just kind of set him on the couch next to you and he's just like gonna sit there and just like sleep probably. So we probably have like another month of that maybe.
We never had that. He was always active. He always wanted to be held and entertained. But back to the work stuff, it's also actually been really nice because, since she's taking care of the baby, now that I'm at home, every so often I can get up and take him for 5-10 minutes. I can help with lunch, I can help with breakfast, help with dinner. So that's actually been one of the nice things about working from home, and even just good to see them more often.
I love the baby talk. I wish people talked about their kids more often. It's really in the industry, it's really a light. So talk a little bit, before we close out, we're going to give you. We'd love for you to talk about your book. Why should we read it and who should read it? Are you writing another one? Would you write another one? And also just feel free to use this time for any shameless self-promotion, any plugs, any, where can people find you, that kind of thing.
Sure. Let's see. First, another book, maybe someday. Things are busy right now with work and the family. But yeah, I have some ideas, hopefully. And I enjoyed writing the book. It's something that like I mentioned before, for whatever reason, like I've always wanted to write a book, and writing a book is not necessarily an enjoyable process. Like giving a talk, right? The preparation for it and the duration of it is, for me, not pleasant, but the finishing it is nice. Probably most people who have written a book would probably agree with that. But we'll see how things go over the next year or so. And then adopting Elixir, who should read it? I think a lot of the things that we wrote in the book still hold true about how to organize your team, how to build a team, not even from an Elixir standpoint, but from a general standpoint, how to build a team with a new language, how to convince or how to support your argument that that you should try out this new language, because it is incredibly expensive to try out a new language. And I think I'd be curious to see how many more people start using Elixir, because you see in Elixir Weekly or Elixir Radar, or these kind of things, these kind of newsletters, these different companies trying out Elixir. I'd be curious to see more case studies from. And I guess it's sort of a catch-22, because a lot of companies don't large companies won't say that they're using a language or experimenting with a language until they already are using it. But I still think that what we've put forth about why you would want to use why you want to use Elixir, or why it would make sense for you to use it, those still hold true. I think also with more generally, or more specifically, I suppose, with Phoenix Live View and Phoenix 1.5, I think those make compelling arguments to use Elixir and Phoenix, because it's super simple to get up and running with Phoenix. And Chris and the Phoenix team have done a really great job of lowering the bar and adding in many more sort of developer-friendly features around migrations and setting up the database and these kind of things. So I think even for smaller companies, or even for programmers who are just getting started, like Elixir and Phoenix, I find it hard to pick another language, I guess.
And do you want to make any final requests or plugs for the audience, where they can find you, where they can find your new gig, that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. We are looking for maybe one or two senior Elixir people in LA. So if that sounds interesting to you, I'll share the article about the company in the show notes, so you can get a little bit more about it. And if that's something to interest you, can reach out to me on Twitter. My handle is BGMARX, or send me a message at ben@subspace.com, and we will try to see if that will work out. So yeah, that's probably about it. I don't really have too many things to.
Awesome. Elixir Wizards. This has been an episode of Elixir Wizards. Thank you, Ben Marx, and my co-host, Eric Ostrich. Once again, I'm Justice Epen. Elixir Wizards is a Smart Logic podcast. Here at Smart Logic, we are always looking to take on new projects, building web apps in Elixir, Rails, and React, infrastructure projects using Kubernetes, and mobile apps using React Native. We'd love to hear from you if you have a project we could help you with. Don't forget to like and subscribe on your favorite podcast player. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, so add us on all of those. You can find me personally at Justice Epen, and Eric Ostrich for Eric. And join us again next time for more Elixir Wizards on system and application architecture.